Beaute bar is coming out with a collection inspired by actual dead roses, so let's go ahead and talk about everything that's going to be in this collection. At the time that I'm making this video, I don't have all of the launch details, but they will be in the description box. The collection includes an eyeshadow palette, a highlighter, and 3 sparkly lip balms. And I also have 3 sparkly lip balms that are coming out at the same time, and those are collab shades with Deandra Nicole. I'm going to swatch everything, try everything on, and do a couple of looks. And I do have a discount affiliate code, which I'm going to pop up on the screen. If you find my content helpful, thank you so much if you decide to use my code. So actually, this collection is called Dead Roses 2 because last year around this time, we had the original Dead Roses. And at that time, there was a lot of commentary about how the color story of the palette didn't actually reflect what people thought Dead Roses looked like. So my interpretation is that with this palette, we are getting what actual dead roses look like, or at least roses that are in the process of dying. I actually really like that because it's given rise to what I would consider to be a quite unusual color story, and I quite appreciate the unexpected. This palette is 16 pans and you get a total of 6 shimmers, 9 mattes, and 1 matte with shimmer. We do have a mixture of multi-chromes, duochromes, and straight shimmers in here. Something that I feel like you can really depend on with Beaute bar palettes is that you're going to get some very special shimmers in them. It does tend to mean that the price point of the palettes is a little bit higher. And of course, that just reflects the nature of having several special shades included in the palette. And if you look at the palette, it's kind of laid out in the way that I conceptualize it, which is that you have kind of half of the palette being grungy tones and half of the palette being sort of muted purple pink tones with a little bit of a pop of gray. One thing I noticed as I was swatching these shimmers is that a lot of them are very smooth. I think there was only one that felt slightly more textured, but not to a significant degree by any means. I will be showing eye swatches of all of these shimmers just so that you can appreciate the shifts a little bit better. Here's what the whole palette looks like swatched to my arm. I think the first thing I really noticed about this palette is that the color story feels very unique to me. There are a few mattes in here that look like they're a little bit close to one another, especially those last 2, and I'm curious how they're going to translate on the eye. But those are the main things that really jumped out to me right away. Another thing I want to point out is that we don't have any hollow shimmers in here, and I do really like the hollow formula from the brand. The first shade we have is Reflection, which looks to me like a multi-chrome. It has a very smooth texture, kind of yellowy orange base, and it has an orangey red shift. Right off the bat, I can say that this is one of my favorite shimmers in the palette. I find yellow shimmers and chromes to be relatively hard to come by, and I do realize it's not a true yellow, but it's still not a tone of shimmer we see super often. Next, we have the shade Transition. I see this one as being a crowd favorite. I would describe it as a green-brown duochrome. It does have a sort of warm-toned brown base with a golden green shift to it. And this one isn't as smooth as the first shade that I swatched, but it's still very smooth. And I would say it's slightly more sparkly as well. Next, we have the shade Lost Love. This is the most neutral shimmer in the palette. I would describe it as having a sort of golden bronze base. And it does have a subtle duochrome shift to orangey red. This shade isn't as smooth as Reflection, but again, still very smooth. You can also see some slightly larger sparkle particles scattered throughout it. Okay, now we're getting into some of those purpley pink shimmers. The first is the shade Torment. This shade has a purple base and a blue-green shift. The blue, I think, is the primary shift, and the green you can see at more of a harsh angle and is a little bit more subtle. I personally really enjoy shades that either shift blue to purple or purple to blue, especially as a self-professed blue eyeshadow lover. Next, we have the shade Perish, and I would describe this as a straight shimmer. I don't see a chrome shift to it, but it is incredibly sparkly. You can see that pretty prominent kind of silvery sparkle running throughout. Happy to say that from a texture perspective, I really do think that these shimmers will work for a lot of people. If you're someone who enjoys very sparkly shimmers, of course. Last but not least, we have the shade Broken. Broken has what I would describe to be a sort of burnt red-orange base, and it shifts orange-yellow. You can see that shift pretty well in the mirror when I try it on the eye. This is the shimmer that I think is the most textured in the palette, but I would say overall it's still in the realm of what I would consider smooth. Okay, the next product that I want to take a closer look at is the multi-chrome highlighter. I always really look forward to the highlights from Bella Beaute Bar. I featured them in quite a few of my videos because they tend to just make really fun highlighters. For example, Skin of the Killer and Dark Dreamscape, to name a few. This highlighter is simply called Dead Roses. I would describe the texture on this to be quite smooth. As you can see, it's still very sparkly, but it doesn't feel textured. And I do think you can see that in the way that it sits on my fingertip. And this I would describe as being a very fiery toned iridescent shade. It shifts pink, yellow, orange, green, and you also have a hint of red. And here's what it looks like in another lighting, just so you can appreciate those shifts a little bit better. And of course, I will apply this to the cheeks so that you can really see this in action. Okay, now let's jump right into swatching these sparkly lip balms. This is the shade Shooting Star. It's essentially a clear balm and you have rainbow multicolored sparkles throughout. I do find these lip balms to feel hydrating on the lips. You can maybe feel the faintest amount of sparkle when you're wearing them on the lips, but I don't find them to feel gritty to me personally at all. If you're very sensitive to sparkle, I can't say that you're not going to feel them though. Next, we have the shade Cosmic Dust. I think this one is going to be a favorite. I would describe this as being a sort of champagne taupe with silver leaning sparkles. For all of these shades, they have a buildable opacity. So if you want to go in just with one layer, you can get them to be a little bit more sheer, or you can build them up for more pigmentation. Next shade we have is Dead Roses. I really like this shade because it's sort of like a burnt red and it has multicolored sparkles. I've said this before, but bright red is a shade that I tend to shy away from, specifically as a lip color. And I just think the shade pairs well with the color story of the palette. Okay, next shade we have is Pinking of You. This is a bold, bright pink, and it has a pretty kind of blue-purple sparkle. And I'm also seeing some pink sparkle in there. And this shade was supposed to be part of the Pinky Promise collection, but I did hear there were some delays with production. Next, we have the shade Cross My Heart, and in comparison to the shade I just swatched, I feel like this one has a hint more orangey red in it, and maybe just the slightest touch more depth to it. And last but not least, we have the shade Ultraviolet. This is a really pretty deep purple, and it has purple, pink, and blue sparkles running throughout. This is the deepest of all the shades that I've tried on. And I do think this shade in particular will pair really well with the tones that you get in the Dead Roses palette. And here is what all 6 shades of the Dream Sparkle Balm look like swatched on my arm. I'm curious if you've tried this formula. I do really feel like sparkly lip balms are having a bit of a moment. And I'm just happy to see Bella Beaute Bar dipping more into fun lip products in general. All right, let's go ahead and dive into some looks, starting off with this grungy green toned matte called Wilt. I really want to do 2 looks, one that's more focused on those grungy tones, and then one that's a little bit more focused on those purple tones. I did prime my lids, and I am really hoping that, yeah, this is quite pigmented. You never know with shades like this how they're going to look on medium to deeper skin tones. And of course I could have used a white base, but I just want to see what it gives. Then on a smaller brush, just taking a little bit of that same shade Wilt and putting it on the inner portion of the lower lash line. Now we're going in with the shade Regret and just building up a little bit of depth. Who would have thought that you would have had murky tones like this in a Valentine's Day palette? And then in the outer corner, we're going to deepen up with the shade Woe. Then I'm just going to connect that down to the lower lash line. And softening up the edges a little bit with the shade Heartbreak. Now I'm just taking a little bit of this shade Morning and I'm going to use it as a highlighting shade. I'm just going to put a little bit on the inside here. I like the contrast between that cool tone and that grungy kind of mustard matte. A little bit under the brow bone. Use the Clionadh glitter primer on the lid. I couldn't decide on just one lid shade. I really want to use both Reflection and Transition. That's the shade here and this one here. So I'm just going to use both of them on the lid. Taking a little bit of Reflection and tapping it onto the inner portion of the lid. Ooh, that is such a pretty shimmer. And then a little bit of Transition. I really also want to dip into this gorgeous highlighter, so I'm going to use this as an inner corner shade. And then just the smallest amount on the brow bone. Okay, I added some liner and mascara, and here is the first completed look. Okay, for the second look, let's play around with these purple tones. I'm gonna start off with the shade Loss, which is sort of this pinky mauve tone matte, and just use it all over the lid. And then running a little bit under the lower lash line. Take a little bit of the shade Wither and use it to create a little bit of definition for a halo eye. Starting off on the inner portion here. And something I always like to point out is when we have a good amount of deep mattes, and I'm loving that we have a lot of mattes to deepen up a look. And it doesn't have to be perfect because I am going to come back with a lighter matte and just soften around some of the edges, but placing a little bit on the lower lash line as well in that halo shape. Going in with that pinky mauve tone called Loss and just softening up around the edges a little bit. Now I'm going to go in with this slate tone matte and just lighten up a few areas. A little bit on the center of the lid. A little bit on the inner corner. And the brow bone. Priming the lid with a little bit of the Clionadh glitter primer. Again, having a lot of trouble deciding which shimmer I'm going to use, but I think I'm going to go in with Torment, which is this blue-purple duochrome. Here is what it looks like swatched on my fingertip. Ooh, that is so pretty. And then just placing a little bit of Torment on the lower lash line. Also really want to use this shimmer called Broken. I'm not sure how to incorporate it into my look, but I think what I'm going to do is just take a light dusting of it under the brow bone, because it has some red flecks in it, and I just feel like that would really add to the look. Yeah. And then just adding a little bit to the inner corner as well. Okay, I added some liner and mascara, and here is the second completed look. And the last thing that we're gonna do is apply the Dead Roses highlighter. I know I put it as a highlight for my first shade, but I do want to show what it looks like as a face highlighter as well. So I'm just gonna take a brush and do a light dusting of it on the top of the cheekbones. That is a really intense blinding highlight, and I would expect no less from Bella Beaute Bar. Hopefully you can see that on camera. I think you are, because I'm able to see it in the mirror in front of me. Of course, I had to apply it to both cheeks. Now that we've had a chance to go through everything in detail, including swatches, trying on all of the products, and creating 2 looks, let's close up with some wrap-up thoughts. So a couple of things. At the time that I'm making this video, the price of the palette has been announced. It retails for $65. I was happy to see that it was under that $70 price point. I think it helps that we have 6 shimmers in here rather than an even split of mattes and shimmers. We have a mix of duochromes and multichromes, and if you use a discount affiliate code, you are able to bring it down by 10%. So I am happy to see that. It's still pricey, but it's a little bit better, I want to say, than Dead Roses last year, which I believe was in the 70s. I actually want to start off by saying I like this palette more than I liked the Dead Roses palette last year. The primary reason being is that it's an atypical color story for a Valentine's Day palette. And I've talked several times before about how I really enjoyed the Morally Grey palette. And I think I enjoyed that for a similar reason. I mean, obviously they're completely different color stories. This is much more a sort of grungy tones and purple toned palette. And then that was a gray and pink palette, but you know, both are not color stories that I would typically think of for Valentine's Day palette. So I do appreciate that this is bringing us something a little bit different. My favorite parts of this collection are the palette and the highlighter. I love an intense blinding highlight, so very excited to play around with that one a little bit more. And I genuinely feel inspired by creating with this palette. I feel like you can do quite a variety of looks. I do think that we have a few mattes in here that are too similar. Especially these 2 shades here. They're of course different in nuance, but with having these shades and then this deeper matte here, which, you know, is also, the tone of it is quite different than the tone of this matte. I just feel like we have 3 mattes in here that are, you know, in a similar vein. So, you know, that is something that I would have personally changed. I'm not sure what I would have put in its place. Potentially that means that maybe this palette could have just been pared down a little bit size-wise to maybe something like a 12 pan. Or maybe since you have this lighter gray tone matte here, you could have potentially had a really deep gray matte. I am finding these lip products to be very comfortable. Right now I have on the shade Cosmic Dust. All right, I would love to hear what you think of this release in the comments. I know there's been quite a number of indie palettes to be released recently, and my goal is just to be able to provide a little bit more in-depth content on some of these releases. As always, I really hope you found this video helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.